right, we are about to bring out a very large panel that we call the Wingspan panel. And what we wanted to do with this panel was share with all of you a little bit of what Rita was just talking about. What are the connections that we see between groups online? Who are the diverse targets of hate in the world today? And what ideas do some of our experts have across disciplines about how to take that on? So with that, I think we have a panel that's coming, yes? I did have a question. I'll take this moment. A number of people have asked me if we will have Q&A, and because the room and some of the technology did not really facilitate that, we're not taking Q&A at the end of these panels because we really wanted to use the panels to show you the breadth of the problem across disciplines. We will, however, have our speakers available to you at the breaks in the hall. They invite your questions, they invite the dialogue, so please don't hesitate to engage with them. That's what we're here for, so please don't hesitate to do that. And with that, there we go. So one of the other things, just as a quick housekeeping matter, as these folks all join us, we are not taking time for detailed introductions. You all saw a little program booklet when you guys joined in. I encourage you, if you don't have one, grab one from reception. It has the detailed biographies of our exceptional speakers, so please do take a moment to look at that prior to each panel because we will not be taking the time to do detailed introductions. I will ask, however, each of our panelists to remind you to just share a few words at the beginning of your remarks as to who you are and what you're doing here. With that, it is my privilege to open this panel. James Pash.
Thank you. My name is James Pash. I am the Regional Director of the ADL here I cover Pittsburgh, Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky. It's an honor to be with everyone today and to be along such an esteemed group of panelists and colleagues. For those who don't know, the ADL has the same mission today that we did over a century ago, which is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment for all. I think we all know in this room the environment of hate has risen significantly, as well as the rate of anti-Semitism. We don't have to even see the statistics and the graphs to know that and to understand that. If you just look at the gatherings that have taken place over the last several years, both locally and nationally, kind of at the root of many of those gatherings, we've seen anti-Semitism. So at the local level, whether that was rallies at the state houses across the country in protest of the COVID-19 protocols, where we saw anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic symbols, whether that was Klan rallies in Dayton, Ohio, or the national events that have received so much attention and notoriety, whether that is the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville or the January 6th insurrection. We have seen at its core this through line of anti-Semitism that has connected all of those events. When we delve into the statistics of anti-Semitism, every year ADL presents an annual audit since the 1970s that catalog every anti-Semitic event in the nation that's reported into us. And we categorize assaults, harassments, vandalisms, and it's probably not surprising to most that 2020 was the third highest year for incidents against American Jews on record. And here in this region, that encompasses Pittsburgh, we saw both the greatest increase in percentage and in acts of anti-Semitism that we have seen since we have started to track in the 1970s. So that gives a flavor of some of the statistics that are behind the environment. And when you combine those statistics with our surveys that we do annually, those surveys indicated that 63% of Jews in America have experienced or witnessed some form of anti-Semitism in the last 5 years, and that 1 of every 4, a quarter of American Jews, say that they have been targeted by anti-Semitic comments, slurs, or threats during that same exact timeline. When we talk about the growth of extremism, in 2020, ADL recorded 331 anti-Semitic incidents attributed to known extremist groups or individuals inspired by extremist ideology. When we talk about what the ADL does, I always say the second part of our mission of fighting hate against everyone is just as important as the first. And in many ways, we view anti-Semitism and the rise of anti-Semitism as the canary in the coal mine of hate. And we know if we're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism, that we are seeing a rise in all forms of hate. And so we have seen that rise, the rise of hate against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, especially with the rise of COVID-19. The ugly open wounds of racism against the Black community, the vile conspiracy theories around immigration that have continued, and all of this combined points to the need to be hyper-vigilant against this rise of hate, which is one of the reasons we're all together here this afternoon. I always like to say, what are we going to do about it? What does ADL do about it? And we try to tackle it from a comprehensive global viewpoint by trying to strengthen our federal, our state, and our local laws to fight back against both anti-Semitic hate and all forms of hate crimes. We're partnering with law enforcement to run trainings on extremism and hate crimes so that they're better prepared. And we are also trying to work with our universities to respond to incidents of anti-Semitic harassment that are happening on college campuses across America. And kind of most importantly here locally, we have really grown our program called No Place for Hate in our K through 12 schools, not just to tackle anti-Semitism, but all forms of bias and hate. It's a student-driven program, and that has grown just locally here from six schools in Greater Pittsburgh to this past year over 35 in Greater Pittsburgh. And we hope to continue to grow that program exponentially because, as we all know, no one is born with hate. Hate is learned. Hate can be unlearned. And we need to invest in our children. And the sooner we're in the classrooms, the better. And with that, it's a real honor to be here. And I'll pass it off to my panelists.
All right.
Did it clicker?
Clicker. Can we advance in the back? Yes. Ari, do you mind if we do it that way?
Yeah, sure. So, hi everyone. My name is Ari Perliger. I'm a professor from UMass Lowell. I'm studying far-right extremism and violence for probably more than 15 years, and more specifically, the American far right for the last decade or so. And in the next few minutes, what I would like to do is really to talk about the current landscape of the violent American far right. And more specifically, if you can upload the next slides. More specifically, I will aim to refute a perception that seems to gain some momentum in the last couple of years. Nonetheless, as you'll be able to see, lack empirical support. If you can just upload the entire slide, that would be great. So the perception that I would like to refute is the idea that there is some kind of an operational and ideological convergence within the American far right, that we have some kind of a uniform movement which coalesced around some similar practices and ideological goals. And what I will illustrate is that the various groups that comprise the American far right actually have different operational characteristics, different recruitment methods, and they also engage in different tactics and target selection. I will do that by using a database that I've gathered with my team for the last 10 years or so. And in the last couple of years, we're also developing it with the help of the Development Service Group team from DC. And this database basically documents all incidents of far-right violence between 1990s to 2020. And we basically identified all cases where there was violence against property or against people by individuals that are affiliated with far-right groups or operated or driven by a far-right ideology and occurred in the US. So as you can see from the initial data up on the slides, you see that we definitely have in the last couple of years a dramatic increase in the level of far-right violence, in the number of incidents. We're talking about 100% of increase. So it's not that this problem is actually now starts to decline because there's more attention to it or because we are diverting more resources to deal with it. It's actually intensifying, something that reflects our inability really to deal with effectively yet. So if we can move to the next slide. So the first thing that you can see is that in different time frames, different groups were more prominent. In many cases, we can witness a cyclical process, basically, in which groups gain prominency and then they decline and then they are being replaced by different types of groups. And this is important because the different groups are being triggered by different events or they gain more exposure and more popularity by through specific factors or some events that are happening in society or in the political arena. And also because they engage in different types of tactics, it's really important to identify these kind of trends and which groups are becoming more active and more prominent in different time frames. Next slides, please. You can see here that in this chart that different groups really have different types of targets that they choose to operate against, right? So for example, militias, not surprisingly, operating against government targets and government agencies and their proxies. Neo-Nazis organizations, for example, have more affinity towards educational institutions. Skinheads are one of the most significant threats to the LGBTQ community. So when we are thinking about responding and about protecting vulnerable communities, by looking at the data, we can actually gain some insight about from whom exactly we need to protect them and how we address their vulnerabilities. Next slide. You can also see that the tactics are a bit different. So different groups prefer attacks against specific types of targets, but also engage in different types of tactics. So some groups are more inclined to operate against property and more engage in acts of vandalism, such as KKK groups or neo-Nazi groups, while others more focusing on human targets, such as the Christian identity groups or affiliates. So again, this can give us some insight about the nuance within the landscape of the American far right and which groups represent more significant threat to which kind of targets. Next slide. Here we can see more specifically how different minorities are being targeted by different groups. And again, I'm trying to deliver the same message here as well, that we cannot really look at the American far right as some kind of a uniformed movement. We really need to acknowledge the diversity, the complexity of this threat, and something that eventually should be reflected in the way we respond. And I'll just say a few words about the response, if you could just jump a couple of slides to the last one. So we really need to understand that different groups represent different profile of operations as well as different mobilization efforts. They recruit differently, they're using different terminology, they're using different narratives. And if we want to prevent radicalization of youth, or we want to prevent them from mobilized support and from engaging recruitment effectively, we need to understand the language of each one of those groups. We also need to identify their specific tactical tendencies, because that will allow us to divert resources more effectively and in a way that will make more sense and hopefully more effective. And finally, when we're talking about CVE programs and de-radicalization programs, which are gaining momentum in a lot of arenas, this is also means that these programs needs to be more fine-tuned to specific spaces of radicalization and to different movements. So hopefully I was able to give you some sense about the diversity and the complexity of the American far right. Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you so much. We've all been reading quite a bit about Facebook in the news of late, and we are very privileged here today to have David Tesler, and I think he will forgive me for saying that this is very personal to him too, because his brother was one of the emergency physicians who treated the victims of Tree of Life here in Pittsburgh. So we're particularly honored to have him here on this panel for Facebook. David?
Thanks so much for the kind words. You're going to make me cry. I get very emotional. But I'm super excited to be here. I'm excited for the 3 days of discussion and of learning and exchanging information because I really do think this is a collective effort to find ways, not just talking, but find actual actionable ways to better counter hate and extremism in Pittsburgh, in the US, and around the world. As Laura mentioned, I work at Facebook. I'm on the Dangerous Organizations policy team, and I was going to start out by explaining a little bit what our team does, what we focus on, how we define dangerous organizations. But as many of you probably saw last week, our dangerous organizations designations list was leaked and made public, so I think you actually all know much better now what we do and how we define dangerous organizations and what groups we look at. But I will say, so I won't talk specifically about the list now, although I'd love to talk about it later. I will say, though, for those who haven't seen our designations list, or for those who are still combing through the names on the list, I do think it is a good representation of the wingspan of hate and extremism, which this panel is focused on, but also I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about throughout the 3 days. You will see on the list Islamic terrorist groups, like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. You will see white supremacist groups like Proud Boys. You will see militarized social movements, militias in the US like the Three Percenters, and many others. So I do think it's a good representation, and although I would like to talk in detail about the groups because that's where I think the action lies, I was inspired by looking at the attendee list for this summit and all of the deep knowledge and in-depth study and academic background of so many of you. So I was inspired instead to try to present a conceptual framework that I hope will help practitioners in the private sector, in civil society, and in governments think about the actual tools that we have to use or the tools that we need to develop to better counter hate and extremism. So if we could show the slide, that would be great. Here you see two axes, an x-axis and a y-axis. On the x-axis, we measure a group's organizational structure. So all the way on one side of the x-axis, you will have the groups that are traditional hate groups, extremist groups, terrorist groups who are well-structured, well-organized. They have clear leadership, they have clear hierarchy, they have org charts, clearly defined subgroups, they have labeled or propaganda. These groups, for example, you could think of Al-Qaeda, or at least the old Al-Qaeda and ISIS as falling on that side of the x-axis. On the other side of the x-axis, you have groups that are ill-defined. Maybe they're so ill-defined you can't even call them groups. They have no organizational structure. They are leaderless, or they have very vague leadership. They may be more movements. They may be more nodes of individuals who have a certain affinity towards each other or affinity towards a set of ideologies. On this end of the spectrum, you might consider a movement like the super straight movement, which, if you don't know, is very far from an organization or a group, but is a movement that pushes forward a very anti-trans, hateful ideology. So that's the x-axis. On the y-axis, we try to measure ideological coherence. So again, on one end of the axis, we have groups where the ideology is clear, it's coherent, it's consistent, it's easily recognizable and easily defined. Again, you can see, I think, on this end of the y-axis, some of the traditional terrorist groups, Islamic terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, but also identitarian groups, accelerationist groups. On the other end of the y-axis, you have both groups and movements where the ideology or ideologies seem jumbled. They're incoherent, they're hard to understand. They may attract a hodgepodge of members that don't seem to really fit all together. On this end of the y-axis, I would propose maybe you consider groups or movements like the Boogaloo Boys or QAnon. If you take these two axes, as you can see, you can create 4 quadrants. And this is where I hope the framework can be practical and usable for people to think about the tools that we use to combat this wide variety of hate and extremism. Because just like the wingspan is so broad and diverse, so should the tools be that we use to combat all of these hateful and extremist groups. It's not a one-size-fits-all. So in the lower left quadrant, I would argue that we as practitioners may have an easier time in using the tools that we have available to us. These are clearly defined groups with clearly defined ideologies. In the upper right-hand corner, I would argue that we might have the most difficult time, not least because of First Amendment rights in the US, but generally principles of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, where we don't have clearly defined groups, we don't have clearly defined ideologies, and we may have to look more at actor-based and behavioral-based solutions. So all 4 of these quadrants, I think, offer opportunity, they offer challenges, and I hope can be useful as we think about the tools that we need to develop to better counter collectively, to better counter hate and extremism. Thanks.
Thanks, David. We're going to move over to Europe now with one of the foremost experts on extremism in Europe, Tore Bjørjo.
Thank you. Could I get my slides for Bjørgo? Yeah. This conference is organized as a response to the horrible shootings here in Pittsburgh 3 years ago. Likewise, our Center for Research on Extremism, CREX, was established as a response to the extreme right terrorist attacks in Oslo and Utøya in Norway 10 years ago, exposing a need for updated research on right-wing extremism, violence, and hate crime. And I will share some of our findings. First, a basic question is whether extreme right violence is increasing or decreasing, and how we should measure such trends. Slide, please. One problem is that different statistics use different definitions, especially when inclusion criteria and data collection methods and efforts vary greatly over time. This image is a collection of data sets of far-right attacks in the United States, and it's pretty confusing. Slide, please. At CREX, we have developed a data set on right-wing terrorism violence covering Western Europe from 1990 onwards, using consistent inclusion criteria. And by including only the most severe and the fatal attacks, we only cover just the tip of the iceberg. But by using only fatal attacks for comparing changes over time or between countries, we believe we can assess trends with high reliability. Slide, please. Yeah, you can just move to the next one. When we used our comparable data on fatal attacks in Western Europe during the last 3 decades, this was a trend we found. There were actually more extreme right attacks with fatal outcomes during the period from 1990 until 2000 than there were during the last 2 decades. The spike in 2016 happened in the aftermath of the so-called refugee crisis in Europe, reflecting a notable change in the public mood, turning more against refugees. Slide, please. However, when we compare the number of fatal extreme right attacks with the number of fatalities, the trend becomes more complex. Most fatal attacks were small scale, causing only 1 fatality. There were very few exceptions, and with the attack in Norway as the most dramatic spike. We can see this more in detail in the next image. During these 3 decades, there were only 5 extreme right attacks causing 5 or more fatalities, and 3 of them took place during the last decade. 4 if we count the attacks in Norway, go back please, as 2 separate attacks. During the first 2 attacks, the violent attacks were mostly small scale but frequent, typically beatings, kicking, stabbing attacks by racist skinhead gangs, plus some arson attacks on refugee dwellings. Later on, the attacks became less frequent but more deadly. Slide, please. During the entire time period, ethnic and religious minorities were the main targets of fatal extreme right violence in Europe, represented in the red part of the bars. But there were some significant changes. Political opponents, typically anti-racist or left-wingers, represented in green here, were among the target groups for most of the time period, but less so in recent years. Vulnerable groups, such as homeless or disabled people, represented in blue, as well as sexual minorities in yellow, were favorite targets for Nazi skinhead gangs. Attacks on these categories have generally declined, but there have been an increase in fatal attacks on sexual minorities recently. Governmental institutions and elected politicians, in black here, have been more exposed to far-right attacks in recent years than previously. So what can explain these changes? Slide, please. A main explanation can be found in this graph. Gangs, typically neo-Nazi skinhead groups represented in green, together with unorganized xenophobic groups of friends in blue, were responsible for most of the fatal attacks from 1990 until the mid-2000s. Since then, the skinhead subculture has disappeared from the streets in most European countries. Apparently, racist subcultures have moved from the street to the internet. This accounts for most of the decline in fatal street violence. Another important change is that organized groups, in violet here, were behind a considerable amount of fatal extreme right violence in early years, but are far less involved in violent attacks in recent years. At least in Western Europe, seems not to be the case in the US. Lone actors, the dark red field on the bottom, have been behind a significant proportion of fatal attacks during the entire time period. And during the last few years, lone actors stand out as the main perpetrators of extreme right terrorism and violence. Not only have they carried out the majority of fatal attacks since 2015, there's also been an increasing number of attempted mass shootings. Fortunately, most of these lone actor plots were either failed or foiled. So the outcome of these changes in perpetrator types over time, could I get a slide please? We have seen less of these small-scale attacks by the highly violent neo-Nazi skinhead gangs, mainly against ethnic, religious, and sexual minorities. Slide, please. Instead, we have seen in recent years much more of the local, but still relatively rare, attacks by lone actor terrorists radicalized on the internet. And this represents the threat of right-wing violence and terrorism today. Slide, please. Due to these changes, we are facing some challenges in terms of prevention and intervention. Previously, violent groups and individuals were highly visible in the streets and could be easily identified. Our traditional preventive measures, usually social interventions, were well adapted to the needs of these mostly marginalized young people, and often it worked quite effectively. These skinhead gangs are no longer seen in the streets in most of the cities in our countries. Prevention is more challenging when individuals are radicalized on the internet, involved with online transnational networks, and taking inspiration from virtual extremist communities and events far away, such as Christchurch, New Zealand. Some of these individuals are very young, others are adults. Although their rhetoric may be very militant, only a tiny minority move from violent words to violent actions on the ground. But some do and may cause great harm. So whose responsibility is it to monitor these online militants and intervene towards those individuals deemed dangerous? Who are in the best position? I know that security services and police monitor some of these online communities and share information about potential risk, and they manage to detect and stop some. However, families and friends are often in the best position to detect alarming changes in a person's attitudes, way of talking, online activities, and behavior. This is critical. Then it's critical that these close ones do not wait too long with sharing their concerns with the police or other agencies before the child, brother, or friend does something horrible. This may save the future and life of their dear one, but also the lives of many others. Thank you.
Thank you, Tore. We heard a little bit earlier about the fact that there are many different victims and targets of hate, including Muslims and people of Arab descent. And to address that issue and what's being done about it, it's our privilege to have Maya Berry.
Thank you, Laura. My name is Maya Berry, and I'm the Executive Director of the Arab American Institute, which is a civil rights advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. I just want to start by saying these are difficult conversations that we have, difficult topics to talk about, but I'm particularly feeling the heaviness of it here, being here with those of you who've lost loved ones and family, and I am sorry for your loss. I want to start with that. The Arab American community is roughly 3.7 million in this country. We live in every state, and we've been here for decades upon decades. We occupy this unique space of being highly visible when it comes to very specific government-targeted programs, primarily around the issue of national security, and then we're rendered invisible as your next-door neighbor, perhaps, or as often as victims of hate crimes. We also play an interesting role in the conversation about hate crime data collection, and I'll explain that to you. Let me start with the slide and introduce you to someone named Alex Oda. I think there's Alex. Alex was a civil rights advocate who worked in an organization called the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. He was a college professor, and he was a poet who wrote in Arabic. But just to give you a sense of it, translated into English, the unknown is the sea we fear to swim in. Every time anyone talked about Alex, they used the term gentle. Alex was murdered on October 11th, 1985 in Santa Ana, California, when he opened his office door and a pipe exploded. His case remains unresolved today, 36 years later. The murder of Alex prompted a conversation around the targeting of the Arab American community during the 1980s, where FBI Director William Webster referred the following: Arab individuals, or those supporting of Arab points of view, have come within the zone of danger. That was a comment made by the FBI director within 2 months of the murder of Alex. Subsequently, Congress would hold hearings talking about the increase in hate crimes at the time, targeting multiple communities, but including Arab Americans. And as a result of those hearings, we would see the passage of the Hate Crime Statistics Act of 1990, which mandated that the FBI collect data on hate crimes reporting. At the time, there was a category, Code 31. You have to have codes to aggregate data. And there was an anti-Arab Code 31 that existed then. For reasons that are not clear to us, by the time the Hate Crime Statistics Act was actually implemented, Code 31 was erased. It did not come back, and data on Arab American hate crimes was not collected again until 2015. And oddly enough, they literally in 2015, when they reintroduced it, simply called it Code 31 again. Let me introduce you to Khalid. If we can go to the next slide. This is Khalid Jabara. Khalid lived at home with his parents, helping to run the family business and to take care of his terminally ill father. He, by all accounts, was the funny family member. His cousin, writing about him, said he loved computers and music. He made people laugh, and his was known for his, quote, famous notorious beatbox routine to Everybody Dance Now. Khalid was murdered on his front porch, his family's front porch, on August 12, 2016, by his next-door neighbor. 1 year later, we would see the murder of Heather Heyer to the day. 1 year later to the day, Heather Heyer was murdered in Charlottesville, Virginia, when Nazis marched through the town chanting, "Jews would not replace us." Both Khalid and Heather were murdered in these fairly high-profile hate crimes, but they were not reported in the data. And it was a pretty significant discovery at the time to think that hate crimes like those of Khalid and Heather, who had received international attention, didn't show up in the data. We have a significant problem with the data collection, and as a result, like the Hate Crime Statistics Act that was passed back in 1990, we got to the Khalid Jabara and Heather Heyer No Hate Act, which was passed and signed by President Biden in May of this year. It's not quite mandatory reporting, but it made significant improvements, and it's important. It's important in the development of our ability to be able to diagnose this problem of hate accurately. And I see no substitute. Everything we're talking about, and I saw the presentation this morning, it was incredibly important to understand hate, the way it's presented, but there is no substitute for the federal data. I want to share with you something real quick before I leave. One of the nation's, our country's most important literary critics, Arab American of Palestinian descent, Edward Said, said the following: "In the West, the Arab is frequently presented as a menace, a terrorist, a shadowy figure who operates outside of the accepted value system and is therefore to be feared and mistrusted. The racist image of the Arab is nothing more than the result of the transference of the popular anti-Semitic animus from a Jewish to an Arab target." Khalid was an immigrant to this country. Alex was an immigrant to this country. I'm an immigrant to this country. As we saw this morning, the Tree of Life was targeted because of its partnership and work with HIAS, an incredibly important organization that was aiding immigrants to this country. This is the wingspan of hate. Alex was targeted. The suspects in Alex's case, the self-proclaimed Jewish Defense League, which is listed on the terrorist list organization and the Facebook danger list. Khalid's murderer was his next-door neighbor. I'm sitting here today speaking as a subject area expert on the issue of hate crimes, but I can also tell you that there's a man sitting in jail sentenced to 5 years for targeting the president of my organization, Jim Zogby, for threatening of violence or hate crime. He is a diplomat, a retired Foreign Service officer. This is the wingspan of hate that we have to face, and I think the more that we can do to focus on the violence and the need to address it together, the more that we can accomplish. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. We have also seen in this country over the last few years a rise in anti-Asian hate, and to address that, we're privileged to have Don Liu.
Thanks. I'm Don Liu. I'm Chief Legal and Risk Officer at Target Corporation. I'm probably a little unique here in that I'm maybe the only corporate executive sitting on the podium. And my title is not the reason I'm guessing I was invited to speak here. Outside the office, I'm fairly active with Asian American causes. One of the causes I've been involved this year is an organization called the Alliance for Asian American Justice, and I'll come back to that as to what the organization does. As Laura alluded to, in the last 18 months, we've seen a dramatic increase in the Asian American hate crimes in this country. All across the country, you've seen significant jump. Cities like New York has seen multifold increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans. You've seen the media cover it, although media started to already wane in its interest, notwithstanding the fact that the anti-Asian hate crimes continue to grow. But the public perception is managed by the media. Many of the victims are women, elderly, physically not as capable of defending themselves. The perpetrators themselves are all over the place. Unfortunately, some of the media coverage has been focused on Black on Asian crimes, only because the videos that have gone viral happen to have a Black perpetrator. But if you look at studies such as the one that came out from the University of Michigan, the Black on Asian crimes are not disproportionately high. So media coverage has been somewhat misrepresenting exactly what's happening. Like much of what we just talked about earlier, the data is very unreliable and untracked. So, earlier this year, I and a few other lawyers decided to create an organization called the Alliance for Asian American Justice. It's a nonprofit dedicated to helping victims of the Asian American crime. What we did was utilizing large law firms such as Jones Day as a network. There are about 90 law firms that we've asked to provide pro bono legal services for the victims. We cover pretty much every major city in America. We ask within those law firms, particularly lawyers who've got prosecutorial experience, many of them Asian Americans themselves. So we bridge some of the cultural and language gaps that exist between the victims themselves and the ability to access the law. And using those pro bono lawyers, we match them up with the victims, many of whom come from civil rights organizations dedicated to Asian American civil rights. Some of them come directly to us after having read about us in the media. And we match the lawyers who have volunteered with the victims. One of the areas that we're having a really hard time is asking the victims themselves to pursue legal action. Culturally, it is uncomfortable for many of the Asian American victims to pursue legal remedies. And there's also simple lack of knowledge in terms of where do I go get the representation that I need to pursue legal remedies. And then you add on top of that, many of the prosecutors in this country are actually reluctant to pursue hate crimes on behalf of Asian American victims. There is the misperception that I alluded to earlier that many of the Asian American victims were caused by black perpetrators, and many of the prosecutors are a little reluctant to pursue black perpetrators for political reasons. So we're actually now gathering data as we speak about the incidence of prosecutors who are reluctant because they're fearful of the black on Asian crime being a political hot potato. So for a whole host of reasons, we're finding that it's been difficult to pursue legal action against the perpetrators of Asian American victims. When you trace the data that's available, the Asian American hate crimes really spiked starting about March of 2020 at the fairly early beginning of the pandemic. You can imagine the why. Many of the Asian Americans were believed to have been cause of the pandemic. There were some who misspoke, misrepresented the impact of Asian Americans on the virus. The media coverage was particularly not helpful in some ways. And the fact is, the Asian American hate crimes continue today. As I said, the media is starting to wane, and without more data, it's really difficult to continue the focus on Asian American hate crimes. Many of the roots or causes date back well beyond just the pandemic. And in our panel, our moderator, Brian Sun's going to actually talk a little bit about the history of the hate against Asian Americans in this country, which date back dozens, if not 100 plus years. And you had to get to the roots of the cause of the Asian American hate, triggered by the pandemic as a scapegoat. Long-term solutions lie beyond the law. There is a misperception among the larger community about Asian Americans, which need education and better quality of communication. We need to educate the Asian American community on the legal and other rights that they're entitled to and need to pursue when harmed. And we need education and communication with prosecutors who have misinformation on Asian American hate crimes. And we need a better overall education of the media as well in order to solve the problem of the Asian American hate crimes. So the breadth of solution is large and will probably be long term. But the Alliance, as we speak today, are trying to address the issue more short term, which are in the legal format. As I said, there are about 90 law firms. The lawyers have done an amazing job of providing legal services that are free. When we calculate the hours that have already been spent, we think something close to $4 million of pro bono legal services have been provided through the Alliance. But the number of cases remain relatively small for the reasons I just talked about. There are only about 50 plus cases that are being currently handled by the Alliance, and we think there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Asian American hate victims out there.
Thank you, Don. We're going to move on now to somebody who is an expert both on groups impacted by hate and also the organized groups that are the perpetrators of hate. Heidi?
Thanks, Laura. Good morning, everyone. I'm Heidi Beirich, the co-founder of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. I want to add to Maya's comments about how I feel being here in Pittsburgh. It's a heavy heart, and at the same time, I'm just amazed at what you guys have done to react to the tragedy that happened. My organization is relatively new, a couple years old, and we concentrate on transnational aspects of extremism, things like white supremacy, as well as the export of hate from the United States into other parts of the world. I want to pick up a little bit on the discussion about hate crimes that we were just hearing. Is very interesting discussion of how the data is flawed, where there needs to be more resources. And I just wanted to point to something that I think most people don't realize when it comes to the problem of hate crimes in the United States. You know, the FBI just reported that hate crimes were at a 12-year high, and for years they've been reporting, say, 6,500, 7,000 hate crimes at most a year. And we know from the Department of Justice using different data that those numbers are actually more like 250,000 hate crimes a year. That means we capture maybe 5% of the data. And this is a real tragedy in the United States because if we had the data at those levels, it would be an aspect of hate in this country that we would realize is a serious, serious problem, a public policy challenge, and we would also have some better sense of the nature of those crimes. Unfortunately, right now, we don't know how serious the problem is, and it's a big issue. We can't address the problem until we know the depths of it, and the U.S. sort of needs to face a reckoning that hate crimes are much more serious in this country than many, many people believe. And I think it's unfortunate that there's an ebb and flow of coverage of this issue that leads to people not paying attention to it. So I want to talk a little bit about the organizations that are the biggest problem for us right now and some of the threats in terms of hate that the U.S. are just very, very serious and need to be addressed. The last few years have seen an explosion in the number of hate groups in the United States and hate movements that are disaggregated, as we already heard, online. I've been tracking hate groups since 1999. It seems as though every year the numbers of these kinds of organizations has just increased, and the online movements that aren't really organized hate groups have become larger and larger and larger. Really, what is driving these movements are fears over demographic change. The United States is shifting quickly in the nature of its population, and people who aren't comfortable with that react by joining organized movements. For years, the militia and the anti-government movements that obviously hate the federal government, sometimes talk of things like civil war, didn't really have a racialized component to them, but that has been changing in recent years as even those organizations have become more anti-immigrant in particular and anti-Muslim. We obviously have a wide variety of these kinds of organizations and who their targets are in the United States, as Ari's data showed. The big problem is we just have more, they're more militant, and they're more racialized than they used to be. A couple groups that in the last 2 years, sort of right around the time the pandemic broke out, that have become extremely problematic are groups like the Proud Boys that are horribly misogynistic and racist, especially anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, and of course we saw them in the activities that happened on January 6th. Several of their members are charged with conspiracy. An anti-government group, the Oath Keepers, also several members charged with conspiracy, were there on January 6th. And actually, what happened on January 6th was a conflagration that I felt was coming since we saw The Chance of Jews Will Not Replace Us in Charlottesville in 2017. There were multiple factions of the American radical right that showed up at the Capitol: militias, anti-Semites, neo-Nazi groups, but also, QAnon believers, conspiracies that have been flourishing and becoming increasingly more anti-Semitic over recent years, but also a lot of people who weren't directly attached to movements, but have also been radicalized over the last 4 years to the point where they were willing to, invade the Capitol and perhaps stop the transfer of power. And we should not forget the anti-democratic nature of these movements and the serious threat they pose to our political system. These groups that became more militant starting in early 2020 with attacks on lockdowns also targeted the social justice movements, the Black Lives Matter protests, which most people aren't aware were quite violent. Groups like the Boogaloo Boys, members of theirs even attempted to bomb an event in Las Vegas. And I think something like half of all BLM protests have seen some sort of targeted violence. It didn't always happen, but it's a problem. There were also multiple attempted car ramming attacks. And this goes to the nature of the fact we have a lot of lone actor violence, as Tori already talked about. So those are the groups that are very concerning, especially those that showed up at January 6th. And those attacks on our electoral system are not stopping. It's not just that we have voter ID laws being placed in lots of states, including my home state of Georgia. There are actual attacks literally on election officials. And some election officials have actually quit their jobs under death threats. So going towards the elections that are coming up, I think we're going to see a lot attempted violence, threats. I don't know what's going to happen, but our election infrastructure is definitely facing some great threats. The last thing I'd like to talk about is what I think is probably the most dangerous white supremacist ideology out there. It is the same thing that motivated the attack here in Pittsburgh, and that is this notion of a great replacement, the great replacement conspiracy theory, which has become a unifying way of thinking by white supremacists. It was an idea that originated in France and actually was exported to the United States. And what this conspiracy theory alleges is that there's a plot, basically, often laid at the hands of Jews, to replace white populations in various countries, including the United States, with people of color, specifically immigrants, in Europe more often Muslims. And that thinking has now motivated not just what happened here in Pittsburgh, but what happened in El Paso, what happened in Christchurch at the mosques, and it is probably the most dangerous thing out there. And unfortunately, it's also spreading to prominent officials on the right and people like Tucker Carlson who are bringing this up. And I think it bodes very, very poorly for the future if we start to see more and more Americans, and there are quite a few that ascribe to this way of thinking, frame political change around a conspiracy theory that thinks that the changing demographics are actually an orchestrated plot to hurt white people. And I'm very worried about how that's going to motivate violence in the future. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Heidi. We were going to switch back in front rows, but I was told that would violate our protocols for COVID. So with apologies to those of you who are going to speak from the back row, one of the movements that is particularly interesting, I think, because it speaks to the humanity of those who hate. And it's the Incel movement, and Jacob Ware is going to talk to us about that.
Thank you, Laura. It's a real honor to be here, and I'll try to be quick, so feel free to cut me off. My name is Jacob Ware. I'm an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, where I teach a class on domestic terrorism, obviously mostly with a focus on white supremacist violence, but also misogynist and male supremacist violence. So that's what I'm here really to talk about today. So I want to give a brief introduction to the incel movement and kind of talk about some of the attacks we've seen. But other than that, I'm going to assume that there's a base of knowledge about this movement given what's been in the news, and I want to try and be forward-thinking and talk about some of the trends that we're seeing. So just briefly, the incel ideology is based on the concept of involuntary celibacy. Effectively, the view among a small subsect of men who congregate online that there are certain biological, physical, mental, social characteristics that leave them excluded from some kind of sexual marketplace. That marketplace is dominated by what they call Chads and Stacys, effectively the stereotyped images of sexually promiscuous young people who are obviously excluding incels from their group. With that said, most of the violence is targeted towards women, young women, but there's also violence against men as well. Basically, the target of the violence is perceived sexually promiscuous people and/or romantic couples. One key element of the incel ideology that I do want to touch on quickly is called the black pill. So those of you who have watched The Matrix know that if you take the blue pill, you can continue living life in an illusion. If you take the red pill, you'll be exposed to the world's fundamental truth. Incels also perceive and claim to take a black pill. And the black pill basically argues that not only do you see the world for the way it really is, but there's nothing you can do to change your life status, your condition. So it's unchangeable and you're stuck there forever. And this nihilistic viewpoint of the world is really what makes incels so dangerous. Most acts of incel violence are effectively murder-suicides, and they come from a viewpoint that says, basically, I'm going down and I'm taking you with me. So just to go through very briefly some of the major attacks that we've seen over the past decade or so, maybe most famously in 2014, a 22-year-old called Elliot Rodger stabbed his 3 male roommates to death before opening fire at a sorority house on the campus of the University of California, Santa Barbara in Isla Vista. He then proceeded on a car ramming attack around the city. 6 people were killed. He took his own life, and he had posted videos and manifestos online, basically, outlining his grievances. In 2018, we had the deadliest incel act to date in Toronto. A 25-year-old drove his van down Yonge Street, killing 10 people. He had posted on Facebook that he was pledging allegiance to the movement. And then later that year, we had a mass shooting in a yoga studio in Tallahassee, Florida, where an individual killed 2 women before taking his own life. And again, he posted videos and actually songs, I believe, on SoundCloud as well, pledging allegiance to that movement. We've also actually seen multiple mass shootings at US high schools and US colleges by individuals who are perhaps not a part of the movement, but certainly echo some of those grievances. And I think that's important. It's much harder to directly link those to the incel ideology, the incel movement, but certainly it's evidence that elements of the ideology, evidence of the movement, elements of the movement are inspiring people who are not necessarily inside it. So to talk about some trends, I have I've pulled out 5 trends that those of us who study this movement have been concerned about right now. The first is that 2020 and 2021 have been pretty bad years in terms of incel violence. There is a narrative sometimes that the movement has kind of degraded in its late 2010s issue, but I don't think that's true. We've had multiple incidents in the US, the UK, and Canada. Perhaps, well, the worst case in the US was a mass shooting at a shopping mall in Glendale, Arizona, just after reopening last May, I believe, with an individual who had gone there to target couples. He wanted to kill 10 people. He wounded 3. We've had other incidents in the UK as well. So we are seeing, escalating violence. I want to be clear, one of the reasons why we haven't had that hasn't gotten so much news coverage is 2 things, really. Incompetence on the part of the attackers and good policing. But very importantly, it's not due to a lack of intent on the part of those attackers. Second of all, we're seeing an expansion to Europe. As I outlined earlier, most of the attacks we've seen have been in the US and Canada. But throughout the pandemic, we saw multiple incidents in the UK, 2 arrests in places in Edinburgh and Middlesbrough with people who were plotting incel violence. And then tragically in August, we had a successful attack in a place called Plymouth, where an individual killed 5 people around the city. And he had posted multiple videos and online postings where he again declared his allegiance to or belief in the ideology. The third point is another one that I want to be very clear on. Incels have gotten a lot of media attention over the past decade, probably because of how many attacks we've seen. But it's not just incels that are the problem here. There's a broader male supremacist, misogynist movement that have also been violent and also require counterterrorism attention. The most clear example, I think, is the Atlanta shootings early this year, where an individual who was not an incel, but certainly inspired by male supremacist views, targeted multiple Asian-owned spas in the area. I think this is a really good case study of how the broader ideology, obviously the long-standing ideology of misogyny and male supremacism, can inspire other attackers that are not quote-unquote incels, but still have the broader aims. And obviously in that case, we also have an overlap with the race issue that we also see in incel cases, but not necessarily as much in the violence. Fourthly, there are concerns among those of us in counterterrorism, counter-extremism, about pandemic-related radicalization. Experts are concerned that those same issues that we've all dealt with over the past 18 months, whether it's loneliness, isolation, boredom, too much time spent online, that those aspects are going to lead to rising radicalization. I worry extra much about that in the incel case study because some of those factors, the isolation, the loneliness, the boredom, too much time spent online, with incels, that's actually part of the ideology itself. So you have a double effect here, not just rising radicalization, but something that actually feeds into the ideology. I'll be speaking about this with Heidi later on in a breakout panel on COVID. My final point is, and it's perhaps more relevant to the purpose of this conference, there are ongoing debates among those of us tackling incel violence about how to do it. The biggest question is on the question of whether or not to call it, designate it, quote-unquote, terrorism. Canada has been leading the effort on this. In early 2020, there was a stabbing, I believe, at a massage parlor where a woman was killed, and that young man was charged with a terrorism crime. The US seems to be following suit, but far more cautiously. But I would say this is one of the million-dollar questions that we're facing right now. Should we be calling this terrorism? Will that help or will it hurt? And is that the natural, necessary next step? So just to summarize, we have a male supremacist movement that's more emboldened, or at least equally emboldened as it's ever been. They are expanding to Europe and further afield. They're going to benefit from the pandemic. And they're actually only one of many extremist subsects within the broader umbrella of male supremacist and misogynist violence. So certainly one of the movements, ideologies, groups that we're going to hear more about in the coming years.
Great. We have one last speaker who's going to talk about young people and the incidence of hate among young people, and then our last two speakers are going to talk about the interconnectedness of the groups and the financial interconnectedness of groups. So hang in there with us, speakers. I'm going to ask you to take a look at time, and please keep your comments as brief as possible. Eitan, young people.
Hi there, I'm Eitan Hirsch. I'm a professor of political science at Tufts University in Boston. Most of my work is on civic engagement and voting rights. But a couple of years ago, I started a conversation with a PhD student, Laura Royden, and we've been working together on studying anti-Semitism among young people. As a political scientist, anti-Semitism is interesting because it's theorized in the public to emerge both on the far left and the far right. But surprisingly, there's not a lot of data on that. Anti-Semitism is also interesting because, contrary to a lot of other forms of prejudice, anti-Semitism in previous studies, and indeed in our own as well, is more common among young people than older people. So racism, sexism, anti-LGBT prejudice, and so forth, these tend to be much more common among older people than younger people, but it's the opposite with respect to anti-Semitism. So we've done a few studies now, experimental studies, surveys, about anti-Semitism among young people, and I'll just share a few highlights of those findings. I'm happy to talk to anyone after. So when you look at young people, say 18 to 30-year-olds, there's a very large group that identifies as the left, leftists, socialists. About 20% of young people identify that way. And a smaller but shockingly large number of people who identify with labels like alt-right. So 1 out of every 14 people under 30 identify as the alt-right. And if you look at anti-Semitic attitudes like overt attitudes, Jews have too much power, Jewish businesses should be boycotted, Jews are disloyal to the United States and loyal to Israel, those kind of attitudes are very low, actually lowest on the ideological left, and very high on the ideological right among young people. That is, young conservatives are really different both from young liberals and from older conservatives. Young conservatives have very high rates of agreement with those statements. And even statements that Jews should be held accountable for the actions of Israel because they are disloyal and so forth. On the young left, what you have is some evidence of what appears like anti-Semitic double standards. So folks on the young left are much more willing to say that American Jews should denounce Israel's discrimination against non-Jews than they'll say American Muslims should denounce Muslim countries' discrimination against non-Muslims. They're much more likely to say Jews in America should do more to make Israel responsible than they'll say Indian Americans should do more to make India responsible. So there's some double standards on the young left, but the overwhelming evidence is that negative attitudes towards Jews are very high on the right and low on the left. The other big finding from the research is that separate from the ideological dimension is a race dimension, where young African American and Latino identifiers offer anti-Semitic views similar rates to white alt-right identifiers. And that's not an ideological thing. About a third of African Americans and Latinos identify as conservative, and that's indeed where we see the highest rates of anti-Semitism, particularly among young conservative Latinos. And it's different. Older Latinos don't have strong negative attitudes towards Jews, but young Latinos do. We've tried to look at some of the explanations for this, whether it comes from, say, affinity among Latinos and African Americans for Palestinian cause. It doesn't seem to be that at all. In fact, young African Americans, Latinos have much more favorable views toward Israel than young white identifiers. We've looked about geographic effects. So, for example, there are some minority communities around New York that live close in proximity to Jewish communities, and there's been some neighborhood kind of conflicts. But that doesn't seem to be the source of this either, as you have very high rates of anti-Semitic attitudes among African Americans and Latinos who live in areas where there basically are no Jewish residents. We looked at socioeconomic hypotheses. Is it tied to educational attainment? And it's not. So among non-college educated Americans, Black and Latino identifiers have higher rates than whites of anti-Semitic values, but even more so among the college educated set. So that's where our research really is, and it's more about diagnosis than about finding what to do about it. I'm really happy to be as part of this group and learning about how other folks are planning out interventions. But step one is diagnosis, and I echo the views of folks here. The lack of data is really important, because sometimes the lack of data, good data that we can all agree on, enables us to just pull out this anecdote or that anecdote and have a conversation about anecdotes. And so the more that we can have shared resources of data like these experiments and surveys and data collections, the more we can make progress on the subject. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And now to talk about, with a little bit more detail, how some of these groups fuel and communicate with one another. Reese.
Thank you. My name is Reese Leahy. I'm a data science researcher at George Washington University focused on online hate. And I'm also a founding partner at ClusterX, a research and development firm based in Washington, D.C. that specializes in understanding online movements. We first started looking at online hate in 2018 following Charlottesville, trying to track how groups that have been doxxed online or banned from mainstream platforms like Facebook or Discord migrated into the alt-tech ecosystem to places like Gab and VKontakte. Following the attack here in Pittsburgh and also the attacks throughout 2019 in Christchurch and Poway and El Paso, we started to really scale up our research. We started to partner with Jigsaw and build a set of tools and conduct research focused on mapping online hate, trying to map out the wingspan of extremism and some of the very amorphous as well as organized hate groups that other panelists have discussed today, looking at how they connect together and feed off of each other. We also tried to develop tools to measure the narratives that they're discussing and better track that in order to help policymakers monitor and evaluate the impacts of their policy changes and counteraction to hate. Next slide, please. So while we conduct this research, we keep 3 key questions in mind. First, what does that online ecosystem look like? How do these different hate groups, either the highly organized ones or the very amorphous ones like incels versus like the KKK and the Russian imperial movement, how do they connect together and share information online? Second, how do these networks change over time? How do they adapt around real-world events like attacks in some cases, or in some cases platform attempts to ban them or deplatform them? And also, how do these, within this large ecosystem, how do these different groups communicate with one another? What do they talk about? And how do they change their rhetoric to evade content moderation? And not just their rhetoric, but their organization online. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this network plot here is a snapshot of this global online hate ecosystem in 2019. This was produced by Dr. Nicolas Velasquez. By the way, all the work I'm sharing today, very much a team effort. A lot of people went into this. But this network here is a large living ecosystem, and it spans countries, cultures, and languages. Each dot represents a community that's organized around hate. So as I've mentioned, some of these are really organized, known hate groups like the KKK, Russian imperial movement, and some of them are more informal spaces. So like 4chan is on there, or the poll board on 4chan, as well as Gab groups that are organized around anti-Semitism, or Telegram channels that are focused on accelerationism. So each dot is a community ranging from 3 to millions of users discussing hateful topics. And each line between the different communities is a hyperlink directing, either in a post or a comment, directing other members of that community, hey, if we get banned from this platform or if this gets shut down, here's the next place to meet up. This is a really common practice we saw after Charlottesville, and this is something we've been tracking over time to really map out this ecosystem. Because of this tactic, this ecosystem is highly adaptive. And one of the best ways to illustrate that is if you look at the blue nodes, all the blue dots, these are Facebook pages organized around hate. You can see when you compare those with the dots on other platforms, they're not very connected to each other. If you're only looking at the blue dots and nothing else, you would think that maybe it's not that much of a problem overall, or at least not very much of a problem on Facebook. But what you can see is these blue dots are highly interconnected when you look at the pathways between other platforms, highly unmoderated platforms. And this is part of the adaptation, migration, and circumvention of content moderation that we look at. The diversity within this, this really represents the wingspan of violent extremism. And the fact that this is so many different groups and so decentralized actually helps with recruitment towards this movement. Because it's not focused on one issue, it's not monolithic. It's able to focus on, each group is able to focus on local issues and target different narratives. But they all sort of center around, as has been touched on in this panel, like the Great Replacement theory and a few common narratives. But having those different vectors to get into something like QAnon or the Boogaloos through an interest in, a more casual interest in like weapons or immigration in like a local town, that vector helps bring people into one group, and then this structure helps bring people in those groups to this bigger movement. So once we had this map, we were really curious, what were people talking about this? But this ecosystem contains millions of posts a day, so this was really difficult to study. So the way we went about this was building a machine learning classifier to measure sort of how the hateful conversations targeted different groups. And the architect of that is Rick Sear. He's here today too, so feel free to ask him methods questions later. Next slide, please. So if we look at how the different types of hate, and we describe types of hate here by, we looked at the FBI categories for hate crimes, and we built a classifier that could sort of detect the communities targeted. So is it racist hate, anti-Semitic hate, Islamophobic hate? If you look at those changes over time around key events, this shows some of the key events throughout 2020 where we saw hate increase the most. And this breaks it out by the different type and targets of hate. So first of all, there's a very strong relationship between real-world events and online activity, but not necessarily in the way that you would expect. So when we first set out on this, we sort of expected if one type of hate increases, say like race hate or anti-Semitism, maybe that'll take some of the oxygen out of the room for the other types of hate, right? Like if people spend, or if one person spends all their day posting something really anti-Semitic, maybe they won't have enough time at the end of the day to make an Islamophobic post. Or if they spend so much time being really transphobic online, maybe they won't have time to make that racist post at the end of the day. But what we found was actually the complete opposite of that. For every event throughout the period of our study for 2.5 years, we found that all the flavors of hate correlated very strongly with each other, meaning that if one type of hate went up, all the other types of hate went up with it. Not necessarily to the same extent or degree, but they did all go up. And this is starting to quantify some of the effects that James discussed, where if one type of hate really goes up, it's not just one group, it's a more broad movement that targets many different communities. Next slide, please. So I really want to focus in on one of those key events. Over the period of our study, we found that by far the event that increased online hate the most was George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter protests that followed that. And these increases were actually notably the most significant on moderated platforms like Facebook, which we take as a signal of it being, that's a bigger platform with a more mainstream audience. So a better signal of more mainstream hate, or more how hate aligns with more mainstream conversations. And this was interesting because while hate increased around many events that I showed in the past slide, like Soleimani's assassination, border tensions in Turkey and Greece around migrants coming into Europe, by far the biggest increase in hate was a backlash to demands for justice and progress. So this has implications that it's not just about countering hate, but supporting the communities that are targeted by hate groups more proactively. So next slide, please. So other research has shown that online hate often precipitates real-world events and acts of real-world violence, and in Pittsburgh that's especially known. And our research shows that as real-world violence takes place, it often fuels online hate and exacerbates it. And one of our major concerns is that this can create sort of a feedback loop where online hate is getting worse and it's creating more real-world events that fuel online hate to get even worse. But one of the reasons we're very grateful to participate in the summit and very hopeful that the summit can do is break that cycle from both ends, countering hate online and in the real world. So, thank you.
Thank you. All right, we are going to give you your break. We're not going to steal it from you, but one more speaker, and it's somebody you really want to hear from. Robert Bone's going to talk to us about the financial interconnectedness of some of these groups. Can you do it in 5?
I can.
Okay.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Rob Bone. I'm a director of cyber intelligence for Chainalysis. We're a cryptocurrency analytical firm, and we contract out with government intelligence agencies and private sector, basically to map out the blockchain and cryptocurrency transactions. Prior to that, I spent 20 plus years in the FBI, and 5 years before that, I was a police officer. So I've seen, in rural Colorado actually, watching militia groups and others form in the 90s, transferring into terrorism and counterterrorism and domestic terrorism investigations in the FBI in my career. And so I've seen an evolution of terrorist groups' movement. And obviously, as we look analytically at threats, one of the great indicators and tellers is financials. Looking at the money. Where is it going? How is it being transferred? And how is it being utilized for the furtherance of these hate crimes and terrorist incidents? And so over time, traditionally, as we, many of the experts in the room here may agree, is that It's a local, regionalized efforts, early days. Obviously, in the 20s of the Klan and whatnot, movement was much more nationalist based. But then, as that was tamped down, most groups went underground, became local, and relied on flyer campaigns, commonalities between like-minded individuals in a community in order to promulgate hate and to create these atmospherics, and relied upon their own personal finances or other abilities in order to transfer funds through sponsorship of material, clothing, banners, et cetera, et cetera. And that moved to the time where you get into the 80s and the 90s, where you get groups like the Order, who conducted dozens and dozens of bank robberies and millions of dollars of funds that they got from those. And they were actually one of those groups who were, unlike some hate groups that used the funds for the larger group efforts towards terrorism activity, unlike other criminal actors in domestic terrorism or hate crimes, where their personal crimes usually only benefited them. So you move through these segues of evolution, and as we observe things from my previous job and now what I do in cryptocurrency analytics, we get into where we are today and what's happened in the past 3 years. We look at Unite the Right. We look at the ability in the blockchain. Bottom line up front is that cryptocurrency can be traced. It can be mapped. It is not anonymous. There is obfuscation of persons' identities through digitized, alphabet and numeric characterization of hash codes. So imagine you have a bank account. You have an account number. There's a routing number to your bank. There's a wallet and a cryptocurrency atmospheric. That's your account number. You go through an exchange to buy cryptocurrency. That exchange is your bank routing number. There is a way to overlay the traditional financial modalities of what we're used to seeing. And what I challenge us to do here in this forum is to start thinking about this as a tool, an analytical tool, as we saw earlier about visualization of data. It's the same thing of overlaying all the experts that you've heard here today and their data sets upon the financial structure of what's happening in the cryptocurrency market. Trillions of dollars are being traded in cryptocurrency, trillions. And that movement, 99% of it is just people like us moving money and using a new asset class. It is somewhat complicated, but it's becoming more normalized. It's 1% of those actors that are using trillions of dollars of transactional code. And what we can do, as in the Unite the Right, we saw a spike in our analytics at our company of right-wing movement of money into different wallets through exchanges. 1 month before January 6th on the attack of our capital, we saw a spike out of France of 500,000 USD, about 25 or 26 Bitcoin, depending on the value at that moment, towards Nick Fuentes and other right-wing alt groups in the United States a month prior. So my challenge is this. I think that there is a way to do more predictive analytics, to trend analysis out, overlaying these data sets. And I'm inspired by the things that I've heard today, because the ability to overlay all this data together, follow the money, potentially there's ways that we can be proactive in stopping movement of groups of money towards other hate groups and combining their interests. Prior to the last 3 or 4 years, you would have never seen transfer of funds out of France to somebody here in America. It just doesn't happen. That ideology is very hard, unless you're on social media, and sometimes that does impact that until it gets tamped down by Silicon Valley. But those issues are a challenge to everyone, and I think there is a way that we can focus, we can be precise, we can be surgical, we can watch the movement of money. Cryptocurrency happens in real time. We can trace it in real time. So we can watch the money move to actors, we can notify law enforcement, we can act. Traditional banking through SWIFT and other monetary instruments that have been around for decades takes 3 to 4 days to watch money and to follow it and get subpoenas and do that. This is all publicly available information. We don't collect PII. What we do is we trace it on the public ledger, we document it, we give it to law enforcement, we allow them to investigate it. But that's the beauty of cryptocurrency and what's happening now. We can use it to our advantage to stop some of these actions from happening, I hope. So more to come tomorrow when we do another panel on that. Thank you.
Thank you. As Robert said, we do have an entire panel tomorrow, Wednesday, on crypto. Check your agenda on cryptocurrency, so if you have an interest in it. And I want to thank the panels, and I want to summarize what really is our recommendation from this panel, which is the creation of a combined data set of the observed interactions between these groups. And one of the things you've heard throughout the morning is that these groups are connecting to one another, talking to one another, inspiring one another, financing one another, that there are a lot of interactions that if we can map them using some of the technology you saw at the beginning of the morning, if we can combine all this information and map them, we can get to the predictive kind of analysis that Robert is talking about. So that's our one. We're going to take a 15-minute break and come on back. And thank you. Please help me in thanking all of these just amazing panelists.